Hello everyone, Tacha Hao. I'm delighted to be here today and to give you an overview of the top legal issues if you're considering investing or doing business in Canada. I want to thank the organizers of this event for allowing me this opportunity to give you this presentation. I hope you'll find it helpful. So I will quickly go through some of the top issues that you should consider. Quick agenda today. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about all of these issues, but I wanted to just give you a general overview of some of the things you should consider. So first of all, let's start quickly with context, and then I'll get into some of the general legislation, and then I'll talk about types of businesses that you can incorporate or create, and then we'll talk about some of the types of agreements and things like IP, commercial contracts, financing, and finally selling your business after you've been successful and you decide that you want to sell your business. So who am I? Just give you a quick overview about me and my firm. My name is David Laliberte. I'm the managing partner of TMT Law, which is a law firm based in the Toronto area in Canada. And we offer general corporate commercial law services to a wide range of industries, as well as intellectual property and regulatory services. We have a particular expertise on technology and media and telecommunications, but we do serve other industries as well. I have approximately close to 20 years of experience in working with several large companies, including 4.5 years for Microsoft up until 2015, and before that I worked at BlackBerry as in-house counsel, as well as Rogers Communications. So I've worked at several large companies in in-house counsel and regulatory roles. So we, TMT Law, we're working together with several partners, and I believe that some of those partners are there with you today, including Launch Hub, which is a new initiative in the Toronto area that will provide a location for businesses, including from China, to come in and do business there. We'll have an office space. We'll also have a range of services that will be able to offer those businesses, including legal services, accounting services, and financial planning services, immigration services, etc. So we're working with all these partners, including York University, which is a really exciting partner that we have. They are one of the largest universities in Canada, and we will be located for the next couple of years at their white space facility in Markham. So we'll have access to all the resources from York University, and they'll be partnering with us. We're working as well with SCP Group, Shanghai Washa, and Impact CPA, and I believe that those three organizations are there with you, and they'll be providing more information. In terms of context, very quickly, I just want to talk about the fact that there is free trade negotiation right now that is, we're hoping will be formally launched in the next few months, and that's in large part because there's an increasing amount of trade between Canada and China, and we feel that this is a really exciting thing for Canada and for China. But we see a lot of opportunities for further enhancing that trade, and we want to be part of that. General overview of the legislation that we have in Canada that's relevant to you if you want to come and do business in Canada. We have two types of legislation, I would say. The first type is the general legislation that applies to all businesses. And specifically, we're talking about the Investment Canada Act, the Federal and Provincial Business Corporations Act, as well as the Partnerships Acts and the Securities Act, which is done by provinces in Canada. And separately, we also have industry-specific legislation. But before I get into that, in terms of the general legislation, I just want to mention the Investment Canada Act is particularly important. This is a piece of legislation that the Canadian government uses to approve or not approve large investments in Canadian companies, especially when the Canadian government believes that it's not in the interest of Canada. So for example, if there's national security issues, the Canadian government has used this legislation to disapprove some legislation, so it's some investments. So I think it's important if you decide to have a fairly large investment in Canada that you get advice on the Investment Canada Act, and I'd be happy to help you with your business if you need that. But separately, the other legislation there, the Corporations Act, the Partnerships Act, and the Securities Act are relevant if you're trying to create a new business in Canada. The industry-specific legislation applies to a few areas that are highly regulated. So if you're trying to start a business in broadcasting, for example, you need to have CRTC. The CRTC is a Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission. They need to approve your business in Canada, and you need to comply with their regulations. Similarly, if you want to start a telecommunications business, same thing. The CRTC is also an important player that you need to look at their regulation. Food and drug businesses need to comply with the Food and Drugs Act, and the Bank Act applies to all financial services, federally regulated financial services. So these, if you want to operate in one of those industries, and there's a few other industries as well, you really should be getting advice on that because there's a lot of regulations that are applicable. In terms of setting up your business, there's a lot of ways you can do that. One way is obviously the way that most people think about is to create a corporation. That's done in accordance with the Business Corporations Act that I referred to a minute ago. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but other ways to do that you also should consider is sole proprietorship. So you can actually come in as an individual and start selling goods in Canada. You don't actually need to set up a corporation. There's a lot of benefits to setting a corporation, including tax benefits that my friend Wei Hu might talk to you about. But legally speaking, you can actually just start selling it. You can also do a partnership with somebody, with other businesses. You can do a limited liability partnership, or other ways to do it is you can just sign an agreement with existing players in Canada, and you can do that, for example, by doing a franchising or a licensing deal, where you're allowing that business in Canada to use your brand, your IP, your intellectual property to sell goods in Canada. So that's a way for you to actually become present in the Canadian market without actually opening a corporation, creating a corporation there. So you should consider that. In some situations, that's quite important, or quite a good way to do it. So the considerations here you've got listed about, it depends on your type of business, your end goal, and also tax considerations and liability. Those are things that you should consider in choosing the appropriate mechanism to operate your business. So as you make those incorporation decisions on this slide, I've listed some of the things that you should ask, some of the questions that that you will be asked by your lawyer, and those questions actually will determine things like the allocation of shares, how do you allocate the shares, shareholder agreements, how are they drafted, what's going to be in there, composition and role of your board of director, and the appointment of officers and more. So I'm not going to go through each one of those questions right now. But I think you're going to have a copy of the slides so you can read them. But these are questions that your lawyer will probably want to talk to you about as you incorporate a business, if you decide to incorporate a business. So now, going to the next step, you've now incorporated a business and you've decided that you're opening up a business there. So one of the first things you're going to want to do is to hire staff. Well, there's a lot of issues that you need to consider as you do that. The first aspect of that obviously is the employment agreement. You need to figure out how are you going to pay your employees. Are they going to be on commission? Are they on salary? Are they going to be hourly salary? There's the Employment Standards Act in Ontario that applies to those decisions. So you need to consider that. Are you going to want to have non-compete clauses where basically if they leave the job, they cannot work for a competitor for a certain amount of time? Are you going to want non-solicitation clauses so that if they leave, they cannot just take your clients with them and go to your business? Termination provisions, etc. So these are all things that are important in employment agreements. You also need to have a set of company policies because you can't have everything in the employment agreement. Typically the employment agreement will refer to the company policies, and the company policies will be also binding through the agreement. So those policies might apply to confidentiality and ownership of IP, harassment process, if there's a harassment, for example, case, occupational health and safety, and also the recruitment procedures, basically, the managers when they're hiring, the processes that they need to follow to hire. So those are things that we can include in your company policies. IP is also a very important aspect you need to consider. You need to understand first, you need to get some advice from IP lawyer to give you an idea of whether you have IP already and to what extent do you need to register that IP in Canada. In some cases, you may need to do that. In some cases, it may be beneficial. In other cases, having it in places like the United States might be sufficient, but you need to have that assessment. It depends on your business. It depends what you're trying to do. It depends on the market that you're operating in. You also need to have signed intellectual property agreements with the various players that are involved in your business, whether that's founders, whether that's employees. They need to have policies relating to that, whether that's partners, consultants, etc. So we can help you put together those agreements, and we'd be happy to do that. In Canada, if you're trying to protect your IP, as I said, you can register it, especially when you're dealing with patents and trademarks. The Canadian Intellectual Property Office deals with that in Canada. You can also register copyright, although registering copyright is not mandatory, but it is helpful, especially if you end up in court in the future. Having copyright that is registered allows you to really save money on having to prove your ownership of the copyright, because a lot of that job will have been done by the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, so you can just go to court and enforce your copyright, as opposed to having to demonstrate that you own it. So it's quite helpful. IP is also protected through trade secrets, license terms of use, and privacy policies. There's many ways that you can draft those documents to make sure that your IP is further protected, and we'd be happy to help you with that as well. So as I said earlier, you can protect your IP by registering it, by using NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and you need to really carefully think about your licenses and your terms of use. Just to give you a very quick overview of some of the commercial contracts that you'll need to think about as you set up your business, you will no doubt have sales contracts, sales agreements with various partners that you're selling goods to. And it doesn't really matter what type of business you're in, you will have to do that. So that's important that those be crafted in a way that complies with consumer protection legislation. You also may have software as a service agreements, which are now becoming extremely common in any industry, in particular if you're in technology, but even if you're outside technology, you will, in all likelihood, your company will be using software. So you will probably have to sign agreements with software companies that are SaaS agreements. And also licensing. You will probably have to license some IP, and if you do, then you need to consider how you're going to craft that. So those are things that law firms can help you with in Canada. Financing your business is also going to be an important consideration. Now, there's many different ways that you can finance your business as you come into the Canadian market. One way that you can identify those sources of financing is to work through accelerator programs. They will actually be quite helpful, and we will provide that function at Launch Hub, where we can help you identify sources of financing in the marketplace and connect you with the right individuals who can help you obtain that financing. But also in general, obviously, there's friends and family, there's angel investors that are there and that are you can find. In Canada, we have a lot of angel investor associations that are groups of wealthy individuals that have capital and have money available for small businesses or medium-sized businesses even. So we can help you connect with some of those people because we know quite a few of them. You can also get government grants, including research and development credit, tax credits. You can get various types of subsidies, including job training, grants, and things like that. There's venture capital, bank financing, obviously, especially if you already have a presence in Canada and a credit in Canada, you can get some bank financing. And lastly, I just want to mention initial coin offerings and ICOs and crowdfunding. This is something that is really developing in Ontario right now. Our regulator, the Ontario Securities Commission, has now set up a bunch of rules to govern ICOs, which means that we are one of the few jurisdictions out there that, in fact, has a fairly solid regulatory structure to regulate this. So it makes it easier, I think, for ICOs to come into play in Ontario because we know what rules to follow. In a lot of other markets, the rules are not clear. In Ontario, they're pretty clear. So that is a type of funding that you should consider as well if it's appropriate for your business. Obviously, for all of those sources of financing, it's important to comply with all securities legislation and securities laws in terms of insider trading, exemption requirements, prospectus registration, etc. We'd be happy to help you with all of that. So the last step is you've now launched your business, you've been successful, you've made some good sales, and after a few years, you're ready to cash out and you're ready to retire. Well, there's a lot of considerations there as well that you will need to consider, and the first one is how will you structure your transaction? There's many ways to do that. You can sell shares, you can sell assets, you can do a combination of both. You can do earn-out provisions in the agreements. This is something that actually can get quite complicated. You will probably have to go through a due diligence process where the buyer will want to go through all your contracts, go through your assets, the ownership, the title for all your assets, your intellectual property, to make sure that it's actually all solid before they buy it. In Canada, that due diligence process can be quite rigorous. That's something to consider. You'll also have to work with your lawyer to work on representations and warranties, liability issues, etc. in the agreements. So that's something that we would be happy to help as well. So I think that concludes pretty much the broad overview of the issues I wanted to talk to you about. If you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to call us, and I will give you the contact information. So, 谢谢, and thank you very much, and have a great day, and please enjoy the rest of your conference, and please never hesitate to